I have a question. We heard earlier Stanford University is really big. Does anyone know how big in terms of gross square feet or number of buildings? Just throw out a guess. Don't have to raise your hand. 600 buildings? Not that many. Hey, who's Googling over there? Someone's got their phone out and cheating. Yeah, 350 buildings, 18 million square feet. Our 3-year capital plan is about $2 billion. So there's a lot of buildings here on campus, a lot of construction happening. I'm with Department of Lands, Buildings and Real Estate, and our team is responsible for managing all those assets as well as developing new assets here on campus. So managing the design and construction and delivering all of those $2 billion of projects over the next 3 years. Today I'm going to talk to you about a project I'm working on called the Deep Lab, and it is the university's pilot project in doing whole building life cycle assessment. I think maybe Brad did some in Carnegie many years ago, but this is sort of the modern version of that maybe. I'm going to talk to you first about how that fits into Stanford's climate action plan and our 2050 goals. And then I'll talk a little bit about the project, give you a sense of the project scope. It's a very unique project, a bit unlike anything I've done before. And then talk about our results from doing whole building life cycle assessment. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about our guidelines that we've developed for doing that here at the university across our entire project portfolio. I'm going to start here. This is a decision from the University Board of Trustees in 2020. It was a commitment to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Not absolute zero, sorry, Claire, but net zero. I think there's two things, though, that are really important about this commitment. They're a little, I'm going to say, pushing the envelope compared to a lot of other institutions. One, it includes Scope 3 emissions and not just about Scope 1 and 2. So that's really an important distinction. And also, I think the university is really committed to mitigating those emissions and not just relying on offsets. And that's an important distinction as well. I think there's unfortunately, a lot of institutions out there that are making these commitments and then just kind of throwing money at the problem and buying offsets. And that's not really the way we want to go. Quick show of hands, who's familiar with the framework of Scope 1, 2, and 3? Oh, okay, cool. So I'll just go through this really quick for those of you who don't know. Scope 1 and 2 is basically emissions that happen here on campus. So it's natural gas used to heat our buildings, run appliances. Scope 2 is used to power our buildings, keep the lights running. And then Scope 3 are what we call indirect emissions. So those are emissions that happen by third parties sort of on our behalf. So it includes things like employee commuting, purchased goods and services, so things like, you know, the carbon it took to make this little clicker and this microphone, and construction activities. So it's all the embodied carbon that goes into the buildings here at the university. This is a chart showing our Scope 1 and 2 emissions over time. The black line was business as usual. And you can see somewhere around, 2010, we sort of hit our peak. And then there's this big cliff that happens around 2010. And I can spend a whole another 30 minutes on a different topic explaining how we did that. But basically, we converted our thermal energy systems from steam to hot water, put in some heat recovery chillers, electrified our energy systems, and put in a whole bunch of solar panels in the desert to offset our emissions. So, yeah, that's topic for another conversation. But bottom line, we've already reached our IPCC goal of 80% reduction from 1990 levels. Yay. and really, we're kind of just chasing this like last little tail of emissions down here right now. And we have a plan to do that by electrifying some gas services here on campus over the next 25, 30 years. So yeah, mission accomplished on Scope 1 and 2, but what about Scope 3? So that's really where the emissions are now. The gray bar on the left, that's our peak emissions in the light gray, and emissions in 2022, which is the last year we had full accounting for all of our emissions. The Scope 1 and 2 emissions are actually closer to zero now because we've had more solar come online. And you'll notice construction is one of the bigger buckets of Scope 3 emissions, which is maybe not surprising. We've already heard about how much construction contributes to global emissions. I think the big takeaway here, though, is looking at these graphs. The emissions associated with operating all 18 million square feet on campus every year is actually less than the emissions from building new buildings on campus every year. I don't know. When I first saw that data, my mind was kind of blown. That's kind of incredible. And so what it means for us is it's really about focusing on our Scope 3 emissions going forward here at the university. So how do we do that? How do we build low carbon and reduce those emissions? I think we have 3 strategies. One, we're going to use whole building life cycle assessment to reduce carbon on major capital projects. And I'm going to talk about that today. That's really what I'm going to talk about. 2, we are developing guidelines for low carbon materials that we can use on every project. So whole building life cycle assessment, it's a process. We can't do it on a little lab renovation or office renovation all the time. But we can develop standards for products that we use all the time. Federal government has a Buy Clean program. California has a Green Buy Clean program. This is our version of that. And just this year, we've rolled out these guidelines for 12 product categories with the help from A10. Thank you, Claire. And over the next couple of years, we're going to be looking to expand that to additional product categories and lowering the emissions factors for those product categories. Finally, increased space utilization. Anyone who's been around campus, it's kind of quiet. There's a lot of underutilized space on campus, and so the more we can utilize the space we have more efficiently, the less we have to build. And guess what? The greenest building is the one we don't build. Unfortunately, it's probably also the hardest strategy here. Again, topic for another conversation. So Deep Lab, a little bit about the project. It's renovation of a facility called End Station 3. It's actually right behind us. You probably didn't notice it, and you'll understand in a second why. And it's a major renovation for an expansion of our nanosciences program. About 30,000 square feet total, $29 million plus another $9 million of nanoscience equipment and instruments going in the facility. So really expensive microscopes that are that can study materials down to the nanoscale. This isn't really part of the carbon story here, but I just find it fascinating, so I'm going to share it real quick. The building was originally part of the Hansen High Energy Physics Lab, known as HEPL, here on campus. It was the world's first electron linear accelerator. The gentleman in the photo there, it's Dr. Hansen and one of his colleagues posing for a photo in their quarter-mile-long tunnel that actually runs right through campus, right here underground. And just to give you a sense of scale, the little circle in that section view in the bottom left, that's the tunnel they're in. So it's actually a 60-foot high base space. And you're like, you didn't notice a 60-foot tall building behind us, did you? That's because it's underground, hence Deep Lab. It's actually underground. And one final thing to kind of point out here about this section is, yes, those walls are drawn to scale. It's 6-foot thick concrete walls. Turns out that's really good at keeping radiation in, which was the original purpose when you have, a high energy electron beam. Want to contain that radiation. It's also really good at keeping the radiation out, which is good for nanoscience. This is what it looks like today. It's not great. It turns out this linear accelerator idea, some people, maybe this is one of those foolish ideas that actually succeeded. It was so successful, scientists decided to build a mile-long version just down the road at a place called SLAC. And so this facility for the last 50 years has really just kind of been shuttered. It's been used for storage. The university's been figuring out who would like to live in a windowless underground concrete bunker. Any takers? Yeah. Well, it turns out these people do. It turns out when you have 6-foot thick concrete walls in a giant concrete bunker, it's really low vibration. It's a massive structure. Nothing moves it. And when you're trying to take images of at the atomic scale resolution, you can't have any vibration. Any vibration distorts your image. And so this is actually one of the highest performing spaces we have on campus when it comes to vibration. It's also very temperature stable because guess what? Huge mass, no windows, no temperature fluctuations. And again, when you're trying to take images at the atomic scale, even just slight temperature variations will distort, metals expand and contract, and even those slight distortions will affect your imaging. And so it turns out to be a perfect space for this type of research. This is a quick floor plan. It's a suite of microscopy labs, some open space down the middle for circulation, collaboration. Okay, so shifting gears to whole building life cycle assessment. Again, show of hands familiar with this framework, this process. Okay, oh, I was expecting more hands to go up. Okay, so real quick, it's really just about accounting for the embodied carbon in a building over its entire life cycle. Everything from the product stage, extracting raw materials, extracting gypsum out of the ground, mining it, transporting that material to a factory where it's turned into a final product like gypboard. And then the actual construction of that material, of the building, the use phase, buildings that get renovated, more gypsum board comes in, more embodied carbon, and then eventually the end of life and demolishing and removing of those materials. It turns out, maybe this isn't a surprise, most of the embodied carbon happens up front, before the products even get to the building and to the job site. And so what that means is it's really important what products we select as designers and developers is really important. It has a big impact on the overall life cycle carbon of the building. Okay, so about the pilot here for whole building life cycle assessment, we basically had 3 goals for this project. One, we wanted to test the feasibility of 20% reduction goal. We were looking at doing this for all major projects across campus, and before we set a target, well, we want to pilot what's really feasible. We think 20%. We want to identify some strategies to meet that goal. What are the right products? What's the methodologies for getting there? And we want to give some feedback and insights to these guidelines to understand what's the best way to do this on other projects going forward. One of the first problems we faced was, well, how does this fit into our project delivery process? Here at the university, we have what we call the project heartbeat. It's a series of budget and approval controls for every project we do. It's a very rigorous process, and we had to understand how this fit into doing that project, how did this fit into that process? One of the things we realized very early on is, early on in the project life cycle, we don't really have a lot of model certainty. We don't know how much carbon is really in that building. By the time we go through design, we start to get more certainty in our model, but guess what? It's kind of too late to do anything about it unless we want to go backwards and redesign things. And so what we came up with was this iterative process of really updating our model throughout the project lifecycle. It's kind of the same way we go about developing cost models for projects. We start early on with a benchmark, and then we get more specific and iterate on that throughout the life cycle of the project. And so early on, we wanted to identify goals. By the end of SD, we set a baseline. At the end of DD, we had what we called a mid-design update to see if we were on track to meet that 20% reduction goal. And then at the end of design, we did a final design update. We also took it one additional step further and did an as-built update at the end of the project, where we took the actual material quantities from the contractors and our trade partners and said, hey, how much gypboard did you actually buy? We modeled it this way in our BIM model, but BIM modeling is not perfect. A lot of times contractors over-order materials, and so just a bit of data validation on our model. You probably can't read this. This is just a tally of all of the materials in our buildings and their carbon intensities. If you've done these kind of models before, it's kind of no surprise in terms of what the top 10 products are here. It's metal studs, steel, resilient flooring, metal deck, wallboard, concrete, kind of those high carbon intensity products that we're all been talking about. Maybe the one thing that kind of stands out here is steel. Why does a renovation have such a high steel number? Well, it's because, remember, this is a giant high bay open space, and we have to build steel structure, like steel modules, for climate control in these spaces. I know what you're thinking. This is a terrible slide. I can't read that. But bear with me. It's actually a great slide. We've talked about process, okay? And I'm not going to talk about, hey, here's the products we used to get here. I'm going to talk about the process we used to get here, to get to our reductions. And this slide kind of summarizes it. So it's a summary. It's not all the products we looked at. It's just a selection. But on the left is all the products we looked at, the AC, the ceiling tiles, the flooring, the carpet, what products we had, at schematic design that we used as baselines. Some of that's specific products that we would maybe typically use. Some of it's just industry averages for certain products. And then on the right is a low carbon alternative identified by the design team. And we looked at a couple of things. We looked at the global warming potential and compared those between the two products. We looked at the cost, because I'm a project manager, I care about the cost. And then we also looked at other things. We looked at design. Did the alternate product meet the design intent? Did it meet all the performance criteria? Did it meet aesthetic requirements? And just other design goals. Were there any maintenance considerations? We looked at durability, and we looked at just other considerations in general. Maybe there was a material shortage or supply chain issue, or just some other issue that maybe we would want to reconsider using that alternative product. So we did all this, and much to my surprise, we got through this and were able to reduce our carbon by quite a bit, and it was cost neutral. Okay, you didn't burst into applause for 27 months to 9 months. I guess you're not going to applaud for that either. But yeah, I was totally blown away. I mean, I couldn't believe we went through this process and there was like zero impact to our budget. And so that was a huge win for the university and for us. I think the bad news came a little bit later when we realized we didn't actually meet the 20% goal. We only got down to 12% by the end of the DD. So we still have a little bit further to go here. I was hoping I'd have final numbers from the final design to share today. They're not quite ready to be published. But the bottom line, we're gonna hit the 20% goal through some additional design changes. But we're gonna have to throw some money at the problem. Not a significant amount, I'd say. Probably less than 1% of our budget. We had allowances for that in our budget, and so it's fine. It's still a success story. Switching gears a little, talk about our guidelines for doing this in our whole portfolio. Some objectives we had. We really, again, wanted to integrate this into our project delivery process. It's really important for us. It's an institution that we're able to deliver our projects on time and on budget, and this is a huge risk for any project manager who's trying to reach those goals. And so we want to make sure our project teams are looking at the right issues at the right time, and that we're not having to redesign something later and significant cost or schedule impacts that affects our ability to meet our other goals. We want to align with industry standards and best practices. There's really no industry standard for how to do this right now. ASHRAE has a draft guideline. It's not published yet. But that just talks about how you do the modeling, not really when or how a team would use the tool to meet their goals. And so that's part of what we want to address here. And also is to align with the regulatory environment. In July, there's new CalGreen requirements here in the state of California that have codified some of these low carbon requirements. And so we want to make sure we're aligned with that, and we're not asking project teams to, hey, calculate this one way for Stanford, and then, hey, do the same calc another way to meet code. We just want to do it once. Of course, we want to meet our goals for major projects, and so we want to make sure we're doing this consistently so we can meet our goals. We want to increase accuracy of our Scope 3 emissions reporting. That table I showed earlier with the emissions for different product categories of Scope 3 emissions at Stanford, that's all based on spend-based data. It's not the best method for calculating emissions. And so we think this is a much more accurate way for us to calculate scope and report on Scope 3 emissions. And finally, we want to be able to compare emissions across our entire project portfolio. The percent reduction strategy, saying, okay, here's our baseline, reduce 20%, it's not the best framework for doing this. We want to be able to look at carbon intensities for different building types and set goals around that. So if it's a new lab building, we should know it should have X amount of carbon per square foot. If it's a new office building, it's Y carbon per square foot. We can't do that quite yet. The industry's not quite there. There's not quite enough data and benchmarks to be able to set those kind of goals, but we think we'll get there soon. And so by having these guidelines, we'll be able to compare projects apples to apples across our entire portfolio and set smarter benchmarks. I think the same thing happened with energy. 20 years ago, we used to say, okay, design it per code, design the building per code, now reduce 20%. We don't do that anymore. Now we have energy use intensity targets based on project types based on building types. And we're going to get there with carbon. We're just not there yet. Finally, this is maybe another slide you can't read, sorry. What is Stanford doing to kind of push the envelope in this area? If you look at the different standards, LEED, Living Building Challenge, CalGreen, they all kind of have different scopes. They say, hey, one says include interiors, another says no, exclude it. One says include site work, another says, well, include it if you want. Again, makes it really hard to compare apples to apples across projects. And what we want to do is, at Stanford, is say, no, we want a total accounting of all the carbon on that project associated with the building. So that's an area we're pushing the standards here. And finally, how am I doing on time? A quick thank you. This was a huge effort, a big initiative over the last year, putting together these guidelines and really working on this initiative. Brad and Claire and their teams at EHD and A10 really gave us a lot of feedback along the way. I really appreciate all of their support. And Eleni, for all of her work, this was her project. These were her guidelines that she's been developing over the last year as a Living Lab Fellow with LBRE. And yeah, it was great working with her, and the guidelines has just gotten great feedback so far from our stakeholders at Stanford. So thank you.